And I'm going to start off today while I'm writing on the board. We're going to do, for our ethical topics, we're going to do war, and if we have time, it will spill over into capital punishment. Now, it's interesting, war, capital punishment, and civil disobedience, biblical ethicists often use the same proof text to compete with each other, and that's like Matthew 5 versus Romans 13. And I want to start with a caution about proof text. A lot of people will have proof text about different doctrines or different positions or different ethics and morality. The problem is when you just extract a scripture out from the context of its book or of the Bible, we can often get what appears to be contradictions. And so I would really encourage you to have a holistic knowledge of the Bible and not just hold random text out independently, but you have to see them in context of the whole. And if you have taken a hermeneutics class or principles of Bible study method, I'm sure they tried to beat into your heads, context, context, context. You can make the Bible say whatever you want if you just cherry pick verses, right? So like Judas went out and hung himself, go thou and do likewise. I mean, that would be a bad combination of cherry picking passages. So we're going to look at these passages and see if we can find some reconciliation, and you'll see how we kind of deal with these texts from the Sermon on the Mount and Romans 13. Now, I'm going to start us off with a video. I found this Catholic priest, and I think it's called Habit Talk. Oh, breaking the habit. That's kind of clever. Oh, yes, they have been for a very long time. And so whether you come from a Catholic background or not, the Catholics came up with just war theory back in the 4th century. And so I'm going to start with this explanation. I think this young friar does a really fine job. And while he's talking, I'm going to do kind of like the original just war theory from St. Augustine. He's doing a little more involved one coming from St. Thomas Aquinas. But I hope this kind of shows you at least the Catholic position, and we can talk about whether that applies to evangelicals or fundamentalists or whatnot, or to you all personally in this class. All right.
When we look to Scripture to guide our actions in conflict, Jesus' words tend to come down fairly heavily on the side of pacifism. Whether it's calling peacemakers blessed or telling his disciples to turn the other cheek when struck, Jesus wanted his people to avoid violence at all costs. And yet, for almost the entire history of Christianity, there have existed two approaches to conflict: strict pacifism, but also a doctrine of just war. Where did this doctrine come from, and what constitutes a just war? This is Catholicism in Focus. Look to the words of Jesus, and you will find numerous occasions in which he denounces war and violence. His followers were to break this cycle, loving their enemies and responding with humility. For those questioning his conviction, all you need to do is look at how his life ended to know how serious he was about this stance. For nearly 300 years, this was the uncontested approach of Christians. Violence was abhorred, and Christians were even barred from entering the military. There were no other options but peaceful resistance. But then something changed. After Christianity became the official religion in Rome, its followers moved from their underclass status in society where they lived in fear to positions of leadership, where they now had the power and responsibility to protect others. For the first time, they witnessed the cruelty of other nations, the impending destruction that waited outside their walls, and realized that they were able to stop it. This presented a difficult new question. As leaders, do they continue to promote pacifism, disbanding the armies and police forces and accepting the violence that befell those who relied on them? Or do they use these legitimate authorities of the state to promote justice and protection, even if it meant using a little violence? In the 4th century, St. Augustine of Hippo answered this question in a way that would forever change the course of Christian doctrine. Building off the work of the famous orator Cicero, Augustine argued that a legitimate authority could use violence without breaking God's law. They who have waged war in obedience to the divine commands or in conformity with his laws have represented in their persons the public justice or the wisdom of government, and in this capacity have put to death wicked men. Such persons have by no means violated the commandment, thou shalt not kill. Over the next 1,000 years, Christianity wrestled with this theory, and theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas and the Dominicans at Salamanca continued to add conditions for its use, specifying who could use it, when it was appropriate, and how it was to be employed. The amount of scholarship put forward in defining a just war far outweighed that of pacifism, and so did its implementation. Today, the Catholic Church maintains it as the proper approach to violence by states and is no longer referred to as just war theory, but in fact, just war doctrine. So what does it actually say? Well, the doctrine, as you would expect, is very precise and legalist, reflecting the scholastic world from which it came. Conditions are set in two categories: jus ad bellum, of the right to go to war, and jus in bello, the rights within war. In order to satisfy jus ad bellum and enter into a conflict with violence, a situation must meet 6 criteria. There must be a just cause, more than just recapturing lands or retribution, but innocent life must be at stake. There must be comparative justice, in that injustice suffered by one party must significantly outweigh that suffered by the other. The violence may only be employed by a competent authority, namely a political authority within a political system that allows distinctions of justice. The force must have the right intention, meaning to save lives and promote justice, not to hurt or kill enemies. There must be a high probability of success, and most importantly, it must be as a means of last resort, following the exhaustion of all diplomatic tactics. In order to be justified, all 6 criteria have to be met. If even a single factor were missing, the Church would consider the violence morally wrong and thus not allowed. But let's say that you find a situation in which all the boxes are checked. You have a just cause to go to war. Now you have free rein to annihilate your enemy, right? No, not in the slightest. Even in situations of just cause, there are still rules that need to be followed to justify any sustained use of violence. For this, we look to the criteria of jus in bello, or the rights within war. For this, there are 5 principles that must be considered. A distinction needs to be made between enemy combatants and non-enemy combatants, forbidding one from attacking civilians, areas with no legitimate military targets, or even unarmed or disabled enemy forces. Proportionality in attack must be maintained, minimizing the amount of collateral damage in relation to military advantage. There must be a clear military necessity for each act, avoiding any violence that does not directly help defeat the enemy. One must maintain fair treatment of prisoners of war. And finally, no means that are malum in se, that is, evil in themselves, may be employed. This includes things like torture, mass rape, forcing combatants to fight against their own people, or using weapons whose effects cannot be controlled. For some, this might seem to be a bit excessive. Why, in something like war, does there need to be so many rules? Isn't the point to defeat the enemy by whatever means necessary? For Christians, this is never the case. While war will inevitably include violence, it's important to remember that no matter the justification, violence is never seen as a good in itself. Violence causes pain and tears families apart. It goes against Jesus' own words to bring peace. Even in war, those on the other side are still our brothers and sisters in Christ. While their actions might be reprehensible and require drastic measures to prevent them from continuing to do harm to the human family, our ultimate goal is to stop the violence and bring about the conversion of the hearts of all. It's because of this that violence is never our end goal. Retribution is not what drives us. Using the law of double effect, the use of violence is at best because it's the unintended consequence of our greater goal, namely to save lives and promote justice. But it's never a good in itself and should be avoided at all costs. And in this way, we might see that the doctrine of just war is not the opposite of pacifism, but might be better categorized as an extreme extension of it. Even in war, even when violence might be justified, it should be used sparingly, precisely, and at the lowest effective level possible. Our goal in war is not to destroy our enemy, but to disable their evil actions. Theologically and philosophically, one can see the distinction that's being made and understand the need for the criteria. Even in violence, our morals as peaceful Christians stand center. And yet, one can't help but ask a few pointed questions, like, is it even possible? As nice and organized as the doctrine is, one would struggle to find more than a handful of conflicts in the past 100 years that satisfy each of the criteria, and might never find a nation that stayed true to the principles throughout. For all intents and purposes, the doctrine of just war is a theoretical framework that has never been employed. For this reason, some have rightly wondered whether it's even effective at all. If violence just begets more violence, how can we ever believe that it will be the ultimate answer to our problems? Even in clearly defined situations with precise actions, the fact of the matter is that it's still violence, something that Jesus called us to renounce. Maybe we're not called to refine the ways of the world, but instead called to stand against them. In this way, one could easily say that the jury is still out on the just war doctrine. For years, the same logic was used to justify the use of capital punishment. It was only used as a means of last resort to protect society and promote the greater good. And yet, at its core, it is still an act of violence that tears the human family apart, and Pope Francis understandably changed the Church's stance. There is never a situation in which capital punishment is justified. The issues are by no means the same, but it does leave us to wonder, if Jesus were around today, would he come to the same conclusions that we do? People much smarter than I have asked this question, and I'm sure they'll be asking it for years to come. Thanks for watching this episode of Catholicism in Focus. Special thanks goes out to Marianne Cray for her monthly donations through Patreon. If you would like...
All right, that was fun.
Their video, they don't ask for some money.
I'm gonna have to follow that guy. I enjoyed that very much. Okay, let's stop the share. Okay, so I thought that was a helpful intro. And in the book I used to use with Norman Geisler, talking about war, he'd like to break it into three categories. From pacifism, I personally don't prefer the term pacifism because people confuse it with being passive. You could be very active pacifist. What I prefer would be the idea of nonviolence. You're looking for non-violent solutions to conflicts, not that you're passive and I just don't want to get involved. The pacifists might put themselves in between combatants in the hopes of achieving peace. So I just don't want you to get the idea these are people that are passive, but they do not believe in violence as a solution. On the right end of the spectrum, we have activists who believe that, hey, we're in a fallen world, war is a reality, and it's part of our responsibility to protect those God has placed under our care. And so these people would be much more into this idea of violence is an acceptable means of dealing with conflict. And then in the middle, we have selectivist. And their take is some violent conflicts are acceptable, others are not. And we need to use things like just war theory of St. Augustine, or like that Friar mentioned, it's now been upgraded to a doctrine, just war doctrine. It helps me, I don't see it as black and white, surprise, surprise, that you're either a pacifist or an activist. And that's usually how it's framed, complete passivity and complete aggression. And I think most people fall somewhere in between. If I had to plot myself on this graph, I'd probably be right here. And the reason I don't go all the way is because I do think there are spiritual principles where people are under my care, under my protection, where I may be called to intervene on their behalf. Now, hopefully not violently, like that priest was saying, that's a last resort, but I too know I'm human, and it's easy to talk about this in the classroom. It's a whole different thing if someone has your loved one or is trying to harm people under your care, or if someone busts into this room trying to harm my students. I think I would be compelled from the core of my being to intervene. Hopefully not violently, but I wouldn't say it's beyond possibility if other things wouldn't work. So that's kind of like the spectrum we have here.
I mean, this brings up to my brain is like, we have to kind of define what we mean by violence a little bit, because like we're saying violence, but like unless we define like exactly what we mean by that is if somebody rushes in the room and you wrap your arms around them and stop them from doing something, is that considered violence? Because you're laying hands on another person for that, or is it considered just restraint, but it's not violent restraint? And violence only going to, okay, you take the chair and knock him out, you know, or okay, violence would be shooting him, or you know, like where's the line of what violence is?
Sure.
And it feels like this whole conversation will center around that. And it's like, okay, but we need to define what we mean by violence.
would you mind getting me some paper towels?
Yeah.
Thanks. Working up a sweat in here for some reason. Gotcha. And let's go down through the theory and maybe that will help. But also what might help, I mean, I'm not in law enforcement, but I have known a lot of folks over the years and kind of like codes of conduct for violence in officers. I mean, what is the guidelines for their use of force? And it would be very similar to like home defense. If someone breaks into your house, what is justifiable violence, right? And the idea is it's supposed to be the minimum amount of violence to reconcile the situation. If a strong word will do it, use a strong word. Like if you have to yell at the person, then yell at them. Thank you. If it means you have to tackle them or hold them in a suppression hold, suppress them. If it means a blow to disable them, use a blow to disable them. The last resort would be using violence to like terminate their life or to end the conflict altogether. So it would have to do with the circumstances and the degrees. Woo! Okay. So the first 3 centuries, like the guy mentioned, the Christian church was pacifistic for all intents and purposes. If anything, the church was not only pacifistic, but it was being persecuted. And you didn't see Christians doing armed uprisings and standing up for their rights. They would either be martyred or they would flee or go into hiding. That was the 3 Christian options. You didn't have to be martyred, but there was even kind of like a martyr mania going on in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, where people would show up at executions trying to get martyred for being Christians, if you can imagine, because they wanted that martyr's crown. I don't know that that's exactly what Jesus had in mind, this idea, but during the Diocletian persecutions in Egypt, Saint Anthony of the Desert, he had been living out by himself for 20 years out in the middle of the Egyptian desert. And when he heard they were persecuting Christians in Alexandria, he came out of the desert with a little band of hairy hermit followers, and they went to Alexandria, which was kind of like a San Francisco or New York of the day. And he took maybe the 2nd bath of his life and got a clean change of clothes and stood where he knew the Roman prefect would come through. And when he came through, Anthony stood and he said, "I am a Christian and I am ready to die for my Lord." And the prefect was just like, "Go away, you smelly, dirty little hermit. We don't want to deal with you." But they would go to the trials because they were arresting like the church leadership. And they would go and become like this cheer squad of like, "Don't recant, don't give up, a martyr's crown awaits you." And eventually, after weeks of this, trying to get himself killed by the authorities, he realized they weren't going to do anything to him, and he went back to the desert where he felt like he belonged. And so I don't think that's what we're being called to seek martyrdom. But I mean, if you believe your life is in Christ, then this life really is not the end all be all of your existence. And we don't have to fear death the way others fear it. So what happens though, in the early 4th century, when Constantine the Great comes to power, he was a sun worshiper, like the sun in the sky. But before he became emperor, they had a really poor series of succession in the Roman Empire. Basically, when the emperor died, the leading generals would duke it out with their armies, and the surviving general would become the next emperor. Not a good idea for keeping the strength of the empire. Anyways, Constantine had already defeated one general, and he had one more to defeat to see who would be the next emperor. And supposedly he saw a vision, and there's debate about what it was. Some people think he saw a cross. Other people think he saw the Chi-Rho, if I'm pronouncing that right. And these are the first 2 letters of Christ's name in the Greek alphabet. I personally think it was this because we still see mosaics of Byzantine art, which becomes the Eastern Roman Empire, with the Chi-Rho upon it. And it's super fascinating. After he won in the name of the cross or the name of Christ, one of the first things he did was pass the Edicts of Toleration. And there were also the Edicts of Milan. This is like 311, 313 AD. And now Christianity becomes legal for the first time since it was outlawed, I think, in around 70 AD. Fascinating. Because it was seen as like a cult of Judaism, and they wouldn't worship the emperor. This is the period St. Augustine was living. And so now things change. Instead of the church being persecuted, now they've come to a place of privilege. And by 380, Christianity becomes the state religion. It now becomes illegal to be a pagan in the Roman Empire. The pagan temples are confiscated. They're turned into churches. A lot of syncretism takes place during this time, where Roman pagan gods are like renamed after Christian saints. You have saint days, feast days that kind of corresponded with the Roman deities. And so you get this weird syncretism taking place. But what this has to do with the topic is, now for the first time, Christians had wealth, property, and a mass of humanity under their protection and care. And so this idea of this early pacifism started to need to be reworked because Christianity is now in a different place. And so St. Augustine addresses this by saying, war in this fallen world is sometimes a necessity because of what's been entrusted to us, the care for those under our stewardship or under our protection. And so he wanted to come up with this theory to show what wars could be engaged in and which ones should be avoided. So first, there's two qualifiers to make something a just war. It has to have a just cause, and then it has to be fought justly, according to St. Augustine. Just causes would include self-defense. If someone invades you, you have the right to repel the invader. And that goes on a national level all the way down to a self-defense level. And we saw that in natural law theory, right, with like forfeiture. The second is intervention for those who can't defend themselves. So if I'm walking down the street and I see some little old lady getting punked on by a bunch of unruly youth, it would be just for me to intervene on her behalf because she couldn't protect herself. Everyone tracking so far? Okay. Those are the only two just causes I know of. Not retaliation, not revenge, not fear, not preemptive strikes, not ideological differences, not over oil or land or resources. All of those are unacceptable justifications for war.
But you see how they evolved, though. Like, it started with, okay, just defense, but then we got bigger, better weapons that can kill more and more people. So people are like, okay, but okay, now we have, WMDs that they don't have to invade us. They can just click a button and kill 1 million Americans or 1 million Jews.
And that would spill over into the second part. If you have a just cause, it has to be fought justly. And even though this is over 1,000 years before the Geneva Convention's written, I wrote it here because in essence, that is what Augustine is going for. You don't target non-combatants. You don't salt the fields. You don't fill up the wells. You don't use bio or chemical warfare. You don't torture. You don't abuse POWs, et cetera, et cetera. It's so interesting in the medieval period, in the 10th century, there was so much feudal conflict among Christians that the church actually imposed what's called the peace of God. And the peace of God meant the church was off bounds. Now, this is obviously only going to work in a Catholic-dominated culture and society, but all of Europe, or Western Europe, was under the authority of Rome. And Rome could actually censure you or put you under inner edict if you refused to comply. So if you had a duke or prince or even king that went to war and attacked church property or priest, they could censure him and say, you're excommunicated, and now none of your subjects have to pay taxes, give tribute, or give loyalty to you anymore. And the way the church could enforce that is they wouldn't do any baptisms or burials or marriages or confession in those regions. They wouldn't give any of the sacraments. Now, if you don't believe in the sacraments or the Roman Catholic Church, that's not going to have a lot of weight on you. But you have to realize in 10th century Europe, that meant everything. They were the keys to the kingdom. They were the ones that could deny you or allow you access into heaven. Then the church introduced the truce of God, which meant you weren't allowed to kill each other on Sundays, because that was the Lord's Day, and on feast days. By the time we get to the 13th century, there's only about 80 days a year that you're allowed to conduct warfare. Usually like Monday through Wednesday, then you needed to chill out for 4 days a week. So I don't know, I just think it's weird when you start to get into that kind of theorizing. I love the intention. It was to stop slaughter, to stop the incessant killing, but come on. For one thing, why are these Christians killing each other? It was probably over power, control, land, etc. Now, if in watching that video, he gave a little more detailed list, and that was refined by the scholastics. I think they had 6 points and 5 points here, but they're still following the same idea. It has to have a just cause, and it has to be fought justly. Now, looking at those criteria, which this is interesting too, because I think Augustine leaves out what for me personally would be the #1 reason for a just war. And that would be God wills it. And in fact, this became the rallying cry of the Crusaders in the Middle Ages. And in Latin, it's Deus vult. God wills it. And that was kind of like their motto and their chant. And I know this echoes back to divine command theory and this idea God's commands are good, God's prohibitions are evil. The tricky part, of course, is how do you know it's God commanding you to go to war and not your own fear, your own insecurities, your own desire, your own thirst for revenge, etc. George Bush actually claimed God wanted him to go to war in the Second Gulf War. Now, I don't know if God told President Bush to go to war or not. But the question I think we have to answer as individuals is, do you believe God called us to the Second Gulf War? Or if you were a young man or woman of military age at that time, would you go to a war simply because your president told you to? And that's where it gets really interesting with these proof texts, because we're going to pit Matthew 5 versus Romans 13. And even though we went over these with civil disobedience, I'm going to show you how they apply to war. I'm going to be reading from the authorized version. You can look at it in another if you want. Let's start with Matthew. And this is actually called the Law of Non-Retribution. I'm going to go down to verse 38. You notice that, the text? That's red. That means Jesus said it. Okay, anyways. You have heard that it has been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And that's right out of the Levitical law, right? It continues blow for blow, stripe for stripe, life for life. But I say unto you that you resist not evil, But whosoever shall smite you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if any man will sue thee at law, take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him too. Give to him that asks thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn thou not away. You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he makes the sun to shine on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. For if you love them which love you, reward have you. Do not even publicans the same? And if you salute your brethren only, what do you more than others? Do not the publicans so? But be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. So a lot of pacifists look at this passage and others in Luke and in Romans 12, and they come to the conclusion, if Christ has this attitude of non-retribution, think about the wars we're involved in this country. Most of the conflicts we're involved in right now are wars of retribution. We're currently still involved in Afghanistan. I just saw Biden said he's withdrawing the troops today. I don't know how long that will take. I mean, that's been promised like the last couple presidencies, right? To get the troops out. And we've also been in Iraq, for these are like the two longest ongoing American wars. But us being in Iraq and Afghanistan, you guys are probably old enough to remember, why are we there? We didn't just show up there on holiday. Yes, 9/11. It's because we were attacked by Al Qaeda that was being harbored in Afghanistan. And then I personally believe there were false ties made to Iraq. And a claim of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, which is interesting. We can talk about those things. But that's why we went to those places. It was in retaliation for what they did to us. And we Americans may not understand a lot about other cultures, but apparently other cultures don't understand a lot about Americans. America has super power in this world, economically, militarily, intellectually. But we're fairly passive with that power and what we could do with it. I mean, I know we got our fingers in about everybody's pie in the world and all that. We can talk about that. But for what we could do with our strength, it is fairly restrained. But when you attack the United States, there's like this weird cohesion that takes place. I mean, this country is so divided perspectively in so many ways. But when there's an outside attack, whether that's Pearl Harbor or the World Trade Towers, it has this unifying effect on the people. And when you look at how many people signed up for the military after those events, how many people wanted retribution or retaliation, that is part, I think, the main reason why they took out two towers, we took out two governments, basically. Now, if you look at the just causes, revenge, retribution, retaliation is not in the list of just war accepted theories.
From the Catholic Church.
Right. Well, and St. Augustine, who was also Roman Catholic. Justly waged, he made an interesting comment when he was giving down the proper ways to fight war. And he said, you would be hard pressed to find half a dozen examples. Well, I think that's being generous. My challenge would be, can you give me an example of a war since the time of Christ that fulfilled both just cause and was fought justly? You guys can mull that over a little while I keep rambling on this. So this idea First of all, it has to be, this is the justification. Even the Southern Baptist Convention came out in the Second Gulf War and said it was a just war because it fulfilled the second criteria. Kuwait had been invaded by a power that it could not resist on its own. So it was acceptable for the United States to intervene on Kuwait's behalf. Now, if that's all there was to it, that's great. It fulfills the requirement.
But it wasn't.
Right. For one thing, if you know anything about the history of the Middle East, Kuwait is like a made-up country by Great Britain when they conquered the Ottoman Empire. We established the Saudis as a royal family. That's part of why Jordan is such a weird-looking country. It was like the leftover pieces of the partitions of like Syria. I know if you're from Jordan, I'm not trying to be bad about it or anything, but it was basically conquered and then divvied up by European powers. Iraq traditionally always saw that land as their own. So in their mentality, they were repatriating what had been carved off from them from imperial British power. From American perspective and Kuwaiti perspective, that is not what was happening. It was invasion by a hostile force trying to take them over. So you have these perspectival issues, right? Most countries going to war think they are in the right or they have been wronged and they're trying to repair previous grievance. That's part of the problem with a lot of these conflicts. They go back generationally, if not hundreds, some of them 1,000 years. And how are we supposed to come in with our, clever peace brokering techniques to try to reconcile what has generational harm and retribution? This very much an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth mentality.
That's when, again, all of the theories covered, they can sound great in theory, but once you try to put them into practice, it gets messy because humans are messy. And
Yes.
Who owns the land? Is it, is it Iraq or Kuwait? Who owns the land? Is it, Israel, or is it the surrounding countries that had the war documents that now it's theirs? And well, excuse me, we were here first. You're saying that man in the sky told you can have it, but we say no. There's a whole thing. God supported Israel. However, if we're looking at this theory, God was in the wrong with that theory because it wasn't their land. They didn't live there.
But God's always in the right with this theory. I mean,
Well,
this isn't Augustine's, but he would certainly agree with me.
And again, so that's the thing. It's it doesn't really work. You have to take a side, and you can sit in the middle and be like, I'm staying out of it until they come after you or someone you love or someone you're responsible for. And this kind of goes out the window.
Sure. Let me read the counter passage from Romans 13. Let every soul be subject unto the higher power, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resists the power, resists the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to do good, but to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good, but if thou do which is evil, be afraid. For he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. And so in this passage, it seems really clear there is a biblical mandate for those in power. They have the power of the sword, which is the power of life and death. It didn't say rod, it didn't say paddle, it said sword. And so I think that's significant. And so in Romans, we have this passage that seems to imply states have the God-ordained right to protect and to punish their citizens. And in Matthew 5, we seem to have this whole different mentality of, in this kingdom view, that we don't want to exact retribution. We're not worried about protecting our own selves because we are in a new relationship to God and with each other because of the person and work of Christ. And so how are we supposed to reconcile the state having this authority and human beings being called to be perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect, and to model Jesus's life. And Jesus, as you well know, was very pacifistic, although not always, right? I mean, he did make a whip, not a sword, but he did use it to drive people out of his father's house that were disabusing it. And then you're right, the passage where he asked if there were any swords, and they said, we have two. And he said, that's enough.
And then you tell Peter, like, what are you doing? Getting
Right.
people swords.
And I personally think it was to make that point. Jesus could have asked his disciples to defend them. I'm sure they could have got more swords, but that he had come with the intention of dying. He wasn't trying to save his life. He was laying down his life for all of our sakes. And remember what he told to Peter. He said, put away your sword. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And so that's the question I want you to ask yourselves. Is there a time in which you believe God would call Christians to go to war? Or is that something that in Christ should not be a part of our thought process? That it would be better to suffer injury upon ourselves than to commit harm upon others.
And it kind of goes into the other story, Matthew 5, like it kind of summarizes like the whole preceding passages with the whole thing of like reward. Like if you do good unto your enemies, like that's something that's going to gain you reward, because like even sinners love their children and protect them and do that kind of stuff. But like if you're doing the good stuff to people that hurt you, like there's rewards for that. So it's like God's like, hey, this stuff doesn't go unpunished, you know, like it's good. But like if you look at it in context of like leadership and all that stuff, like letting your children be raped by somebody that you can stop, I think is bad, because it implies that even the pagans do what is natural and normal to defend what is good, or to help those that love them too. So it's like there's an inference that, hey, loving your kids, doing right, protecting them, taking care of them is even, it's not, we don't even need to talk about it. Like, yeah, we know that you need to do those things, but like if you also love your enemies and those who persecute you individually, then yeah, just go like give them your stuff, give them your coat, turn your other cheek. But even there's like even interesting breakdowns culturally of like what it meant to be like smacked across the cheek and how that was the back of the hand, and like, hey, well, now you can also smack me again. And like it doesn't mean like, and then I mean it's again a whole area of debate, but it's like it doesn't mean just like, yeah, they can stab you with a sword, and you're like, okay, here's my back too. Like it doesn't mean like people take that to mean like never any defense of yourself. But it was talking about, and the one thing that it was interesting, like culture, it was like an insult. It was like you were being denigrated. It wasn't like they're trying to harm you. They were disrespecting you in your position. Like, and okay, hey, well, I can take the abuse for Christ, not, oh, they're trying to kill me. I can just let them do it, you know.
Now, that is interesting. And some Christians believe, this is how I was brought up, and I have certainly questioned it since, but this idea was if you were being disabused or even physically harmed because you're a Christian or because of your faith, you're supposed to just take it. But if it's for your property, or they're trying to molest your women folk, or they're trying to steal your bike or whatever, then you can intervene because it's not a religious persecution. It's just
That seems to be very Bible.
carnality, right? Now, I'm not sure where that came from, this idea, because Jesus isn't making those qualifiers in Matthew 5, certainly. Let me read one more passage. This is Romans 12, right before he goes into the rights of the government and their authority. This is how he ends chapter 12 of Romans. Provide things honest in the sight of all men, if it be possible, as much as lieth within you, live peaceably with all men. So from our side, it should always be peacemakers, peace loving, but it may not be up to us, right? We can't control the actions of others. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thy enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in doing so, thou shalt heap coals of fire upon his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. And I love that. It just makes so much sense to me. If we use violence to fight violence, we double the violence or we perpetuate the violence. But it's scary, right? Who among us wants to try to diffuse violence with pacifism or nonviolence? Because we open ourselves and those we care about to all sorts of potential physical, economic, emotional harm. And so this tension, and I was pretty much set on the selectivist side, maybe even activist side, that, hey, we're living in a godly country, God is on our side, USA. And all of this God and country kind of stuff I was brought up with. And that did not change until I was probably in my early 20s and I came across a book by Leo Tolstoy, the guy who wrote the epic War and Peace, which is actually an anti-war novel. And so he's this Russian Christian existential novelist, and he wrote a book called The Kingdom of Heaven is Within You, taken from the passage in Luke where the Pharisees are asking, what are the signs of the kingdom? When will it come? And Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven is within you or in the midst of you, which I take it to mean wherever Jesus is, his kingdom is. And that means if his spirit is within us, we are in kingdom life right now. Not that there's not a future kingdom coming, but we are citizens of that kingdom here and now. So in this book by Leo Tolstoy, wait, it's bad. It really challenged a lot of the views I grew up with. And basically what he was saying in this book is he took the scripture quite literally, and then he began to ask questions about war, like, who is it that goes to war and why? And he says, here you have these older men sitting in seats of power, and they are making decisions that could cost the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of their own citizens, and in those countries in which they wish to have conflict. And part of what was happening in the time he wrote, it was towards the end of Tsarist Russia. Russia's coming out of the feudal system into the industrial situation. And the church and state were like this, the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Tsarist monarchy. And basically they were exploiting and using the peasants and serfs. And the way they would do this is they would simply go into these cities. The Tsar would send a commission or troops to collect taxes or distribute punishment or whatever it was. And then they would have the peasants themselves do the punishing of the other peasants. And Tolstoy was just like, why are you aiding and abetting those that are oppressing you? Wouldn't it be better to simply say, no, I'm not going to participate. I'm not going to beat my fellow peasant because he didn't pay his taxes or he didn't do what the Tsar wanted him to do. And basically he's saying, stop complying or stop being a part of the violence. If the everyday common soldier simply refused to fight, chances are these old men in different countries coming up with these wars and conflicts are not going to go out and fight each other. They want to do it through proxies, through their young men and people of their country. And so his solution, as idealistic and unrealistic as it sounds, was stop participating in the violence. Tolstoy was a total pacifist. And when people asked him, he said, yeah, if people broke into my house to rob me or harm my wife and daughters, he said, I would not physically intervene. Now, that's too much for me personally. I get his point of view, and he wants to trust in God, not his own strength or his own gun in the closet or whatever. But it's interesting to think in those terms of total pacifism. Where do I want to go from there? Any questions on that kind of position before I segue back?
I mean, there's people that still hold that. Like I grew up and told this story growing up. I don't think it was Ohio, but it was like basically he was like the Leo. He was like believed Leo's full-fledged doctrine of like full passes no matter what. And like basically there was these like young like gangs that found out about it. They would come in and they would rape his wife and his daughter. I think he had one daughter. And he called the police afterwards and other report and all that stuff, but he didn't intervene, even though he could have. And they came back again to do it, and he still just stood by and let his wife and his daughter, his child, his little baby girl.
Yeah.
I can't do anything. And it's just, and for me, that was always just infuriating hearing that. I'm just like, no, like, God everywhere, because people love to pull Jesus out of context to like the Father, right, of God, or like, you know, it's like the cherry picking verses. We don't talk about the Old Testament because it's only New Testament. Oh, we must follow the law because the New Testament doesn't fight. You know, that balance towards the view of God is still the God of justice, mercy, telling people to defend themselves, fight and kill and all this stuff. Like Jesus says, do not murder. He specifies, do not murder, do not kill. So the options on the table. In throughout all of Acts, like you have soldiers in jail becoming, Christians, and never is Paul saying like, okay, lay down your arms, quit your job, you have to become pacifists. You never see that.
Although you do see the admonition to the centurion, right? He's not told to resign his commission, but he's told not to use his position for violence or extortion. So,
Where's that at? I'll double check on that.
yeah. But I think that's really interesting. So for the total pacifist, this idea that no Christian should be involved in military service seems to fly in light of the biblical examples, because when these military officers did come to Christ, they did not feel compelled to necessarily leave their commission. But how they functioned in their role was hopefully categorically different than it was before they had come to Christ. Tolstoy, because of his total pacifistic view, he could not reconcile the God of the Old Testament with the God of the New Testament. And he basically saw them as like two different gods. Big problem for someone that's coming from a fundamentalist background or taking that there is one God in three persons, right? And so how do we reconcile this God of the Old Testament, this God of war, genocide, wrath, destruction, violence, with the God of the New Testament, Jesus, who seems to be like a gentle reed. He seems almost completely passive, like a lamb going to the slaughter. He could have called legions of angels. He could have encouraged the Jews to rise up and revolt against the Romans. He could have done a lot of military things, but his theme over and over again, and why I think Tolstoy is still of value, is he's like, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom was of this world, my servants would fight. But he's thinking of a different kingdom. And for my total pacifist friends, I have a few, I don't know how they're going to respond when Jesus returns, because in the second coming, he's coming, in my understanding, I understand people had different ideas of his first coming was going to be like a warlord, a revenger against those who did evil. But my understanding in the second coming is he's coming with a sword and the saints with him. And there will be massive violence and retribution and revenge. And I would say that is the place of God. And that's why I would qualify this with God's will. But barring God's will, back to my question, can you think of examples of just war in the past 2,000 years that fulfilled just cause and were fought justly? And I honestly can't think of a one.
I can see it like they started to be that way. Like,
Some could have started with a just cause.
Like, oh hey, like you look at European countries, like they're being invaded, their citizens are being killed, you have Jews being put into conflict, you have murder, you have, homosexuals and retarded people being murdered as well. Like just cause starts out good, but once you are into the war, again, things get very blurry very quickly. And once you initiate a fight, so you can go into, who was it? Ryan might know, the one journalist, like, all the best way to find something to go out the window as soon as the first shot is fired or whatnot. Like, you can have the intentions going into it, the ontological view of things. But once you're in that, things change. You have to respond to this from the law, right? Like, you have to make plans, you have to protect not only the people that were being abused, now you have to worry about your soldiers and what's going on with them, or we're going to risk it. Like,
Right.
it's, again, we're taking the Roman Catholic position of this just war, but like we're trying to make an evangelical, like just war doctrine, like what we can come up with. And you find people all over the spectrum.
Or if we want to go with the theme of my book, it would be like, can you imagine a scenario where the Spirit would call you into violence against another human or another state? And if so, what would those criteria be? And how can you be in the Spirit? How do you fulfill Jesus's love your enemy, bless them that curse you, pray for them that despitefully use you? And how do we apply that to like an armed conflict? Is it possible to love someone and kill them simultaneously? Now, I've had students in here, even some ex-military, who said, absolutely. And I was like, okay, I'm not going to tell you what you can and can't do. I just personally don't know how I could do that. How I could say I love someone, but still be willing to take their life.
Well, this goes into the whole thing of like, is it one side of your coin? Is it only love your enemies? No, it's also, the expectation that, you love your neighbor, you love everything, you love your neighbor as yourself. Well, if you're letting your neighbor be slaughtered in the middle of the night because you don't want to hurt your enemy, you're not fulfilling that commandment. Like, that's the second greatest commandment. Like, again, it's not either or. Sometimes it's both and. Like, yes, I do love my enemy. I want to give you water, and if you lay down your drums, here. If you desert your country, hey, I'm gonna give you some water. Come over here. Or like, you capture your enemies. You don't torture your POWs just because you're mad at them or nothing like that. But like, hey, if it comes down to my neighbor versus the guy trying to kill him, there's a choice that has to be made. I can do nothing but see what happens, or I can love my neighbor by helping him out.
Sure.
Or I can love my enemy and be like, help him out, kill him.
Right. Okay, so when we go back to those like just causes and just ways of fighting, that is what I want you to think about as a Christian. Is it possible that God could call you to be in the military? Now, a strict pacifist would say absolutely not. It's antithetical to everything that God has proclaimed under Christ in this age of grace. We're no longer under the law. But like we mentioned those examples in the New Testament, just because people converted didn't mean that they were asked to leave.
That's also an argument from silence, but we don't know they did it. We just don't know if they did.
Sure.
So
My point would be, though, that I believe we are called to be salt and light wherever God has placed us, whether that's in the military, whether that's a professor in the classroom, whether you're an auto mechanic, whether you're a baker. And I personally would rather have Christians in the military, but I would warn young people that you have to have an incredibly strong character, because are you able to stand up and say, no, I'm not doing that, or I'm not going to participate in that? Because in a military context, that could have severe, even life-threatening ramifications if you disregard a direct order, especially in a field or battle command situation.
So another way to probably look at it then, and I'll only speak for the ones I know, maybe Ryan would speak better at this, but even if you go to war and say, like in Iraq, my brother-in-law had to kill babies because, or little girls, because they, and the detrimental effects 10, 15 years later that it does to you as a human being and to your psyche, was it actually worth it in that moment? And so the effects of war and having to do things in the PTSD that you live with, that's part of an aspect of, is this just as well?
Sure.
Because the humans that have to, the young 18, 19-year-old men and women that actually do these things, what's their life like for the next 40, 50 years?
Right. And think about American society. I think only like 1% of the population is active military, maybe 7% if you include veterans or have had some military experience. So that means like 93% of the US population is kind of disconnected from that military worldview. But what happens is, it's kind of like law enforcement. You get in sort of these bubble mentalities where all the other people you know are military or ex-military. You may even live on a base, you shop at military stores. And it's easy to see non-military people as the other or uninformed or not true citizens, or they don't understand or they don't get it. Did you want to comment on that, Ryan? I see some head action.
Well, just like because I served in the military, you think people, like when I was in, people would look at me thinking, oh, I'm less than? Is that what you mean?
No, I think it's
Okay.
possible for military people to think other Americans are less than.
Oh,
They haven't sacrificed or committed to the degree that military people have.
just a smidge.
That was the whole thing, not that any of you watch Starship Troopers, but in that sci-fi, you could not vote unless you'd served in the military.
Yeah.
The
But
state
you know
of
what, though, in Israel, everybody has to serve.
Everybody.
So.
2 years before you get on with your life. Thailand, everyone has to be a Buddhist monk for 2 years before they get on with their life. Fascinating. Yeah, go ahead.
I never thought of other people that weren't in the military as less than. I always saw it just like, if you're not in it, you just don't understand it. That's how I see it.
Sure.
It's like you just have to be in it to understand it.
Which makes sense, right?
That's it. Nothing like, there's no judgment for you not being in the military. At least that's how I look at it. So.
And I actually watched a TED Talk this morning about a vet who was trying to explain this dynamic and his frustration and his belief that we need to understand each other better. Those in the military need to understand civilians better, and civilians need to understand people who are in the military. Because people in the military, civilians either, we have this kind of like split thing, like, oh, thank you for your service. I mean, we don't know them. We don't know what they did or didn't do, what kind of soldier they, but it's just that response, that socially accepted thank you for serving. But then we also kind of can get this mentality of, okay, you're in this like military bubble where you're out there and you're not really in the civilian way of life. I mean, like you are, but you aren't.
It's like you're still a human. Like, so it's like, you know, when I was still living out. I live in Pacific Beach, so it's just like you're still a human. Like, you're just in the military. It's a weird one. I don't know how to explain it.
Let me pivot a little to law enforcement and see if this helps at all. Like many people who are police or sheriffs, that becomes their world, their core. And because they're only dealing with kind of like the problems of society, they don't get like happy house calls usually, right? Of people in domestic bliss, they get called to domestic violence. And if you're spending 8 hours a day dealing with lawbreakers and domestic violence and abuse and drug addicts and prostitution, it can take its toll on you. And I think the similar thing can happen in the military. When you're being asked to go and put your life on the line so that the rest of us can stay at home and watch our big screen TVs and eat ding dongs, it can be hard sometimes to respect the civilians who don't understand what military people have gone through. That's all I'm implying.
Yeah.
Not that military people can't, and many of them are doing it because they love civilians and they don't want everyone to have to be military. But that's part of the difference between having a volunteer army and a draft, kind of like what we were alluding to in Israel, where that just becomes part of your civic duty. It's an expectation, everyone does it. I asked an Israeli friend of mine, what do they do with the pacifist? And she said, what's a pacifist? I was like, you're telling me there's no pacifist
Right over there.
in Israel? And she honestly didn't even know what it meant. I had to explain it to her.
we also have to look at their daily life, though. Their life isn't like 300 million people in the US where you can live almost anywhere and go without seeing any violence in your entire life. We have a very small country where you're very likely at some point in life a rocket will explode in the neighborhood you're in or next to you. They get thousands of rockets all the time. Like locked up, like it's different. And that's why I really hate the whole experiential like knowledge phenomenon we have, this existentialism. Like I get it to a point, I agree with it to a point, but like you can't understand someone else unless you've actually been there. Like, what do we have this thing between our ears for? Like we can't understand exactly, but we can get a good approximation of what's going on, else we would never experience.
I don't know if I could honestly say, or we could legitimately say that we know what it's like for them in war if we've never been there.
Not exactly, but you can get an idea of the horrors of war. You can get an idea of the tactics of it all. You can get.
Yeah, but where are we gonna get Elijah? From our movies, novels?
Autobiographies, all these
Yeah, you
things.
get it from actual accounts of people actually being there.
That's what I'm saying, we can only listen to you guys and take what you guys tell us.
And that's what I said. That's my whole statement was.
Because Hollywood likes to dramatize everything. So
I was in, I know some of this stuff. I don't understand like what Ryan does. Ryan's in combat, I never did. But again, it's like, don't talk to me, you don't understand. I hate that because it's like, it's so isolating to, like, we talked about that when we talked about existentialism. If you think no one can ever understand me at all, like, I'm just alone, you're just alone.
but I also feel like as the service member yourself, you should give a little grace and have a little bit of an open mind to people that may not understand or may not comprehend what you're trying to say. And maybe all they can think of saying is, hey, thanks for your service, or man, I'm so sorry about that. And just you as the service member need to have a little bit of grace. Because trust me, I have millions of conversations with people who go, how was it? Did you kill anybody? Blah, blah, blah. How was this? How was that? They ask me a million questions. And I go, listen, I just don't want to talk about it right now. This is not the place or nor the time. I appreciate what you say to me. And I appreciate, you supporting vets and everything. But, that type of topic of conversation isn't for right now. I feel like that's on the service member themselves, though, to be honest.
And I think it would be helpful for civilians as well to educate themselves. And like you're saying, get to talk to people in the right context, in the right place, right? You don't just bring this up in casual conversation while you're standing in line, like how many people did you kill, or what was the worst thing you had to do, or any of these sorts of things. But also we have to remember, as a culture, here we've brought people up or enculturated people, basically telling them violence isn't the solution. And then we retrain them to actually know how to kill and to use violence as a means to fulfill objectives. And then we ask them to come back and turn that switch off again. And that's very difficult, as you can imagine. And I was reading something like, something like 25% of the homeless population is made up of veterans, even though they only account for like 7%. How did that work? I should bring up that other talk. Anyways, there's a disproportionate amount. I believe more military people died of suicide than combat deaths. At least the last video I watched in 2013. Those are just shocking statistics to think about.
22 veterans a day die by suicide.
22 a day.
22 a day.
That's like one will have killed themselves during our class, if you put it in that kind of context. And so I think we need to understand as a society what we're asking people to do, and then we send them out, and then in many cases, we seem to abandon them. And how are we reintegrating people back into the culture? How do we help people deal with the trauma that they experienced or were a part of? And what can we do to mitigate that? And that's part of why, just in wrapping up, why I'm not a total pacifist or total activist. I believe God does call us uniquely to different places and positions, but that we are to be salt and light in those positions. Whether God's called you to a more pacifistic end of the spectrum, or he's called you to active duty, can you do that in the spirit? And I believe you can, but it may mean standing up and simply saying, no, I can't do that. I respectfully cannot comply with what you're asking me to do. But that takes so much character. But I think God expects that with whatever we're doing in life. Whether you're law enforcement, whether you're a civilian, can you say, no, I'm not doing this? And maybe if we would have had more people like that, we could have avoided some of the atrocities or problems we've had in the past, where people simply out of fear or out of retribution or revenge went ahead and did things that then disparage our own name, our own military, our own
And
things.
I feel like that unfortunately has to come from the highest person on the totem pole. Starts at the top, you
It
know,
does.
because during World War II and even during today's conflicts, there are people who use religion to say, I'm not going to fire a weapon, or they are celibate with firing weapons and being in a combat type of position. But they're only helping themselves and their situation and their family, versus at the top they can disseminate it down and everybody can have that same type of view. So until it changes from the top, shit ain't gonna change.
I hear you.
But there's also America where the top is really all of us, in theory.
Sure. Okay. I'm going to wrap this one up, but please think about it. Think about yourself. Think about what God's called you to do. And this is a tough topic. We're going to be going online for the rest of the semester. I'll put it in the dashboard, but we'll plan on taking the final. I'll do the final with whoever wants to show up during class time on the 29th. That's a week from Thursday. And that gives us, is that right?
I think it's 2 weeks.
2 weeks from Thursday. That gives us 3 more sessions. And so we're going to meet online for those, same time, but you just connect to me wherever you are. All right. It'll be nice to teach without a mask for a few sessions. So
For the biblical Christian worldview on via live text, you have like 2 different